Hello everyone, my name is Amit Schnitzer and I'm a cloud security solution expert within Check Point. In this video I will show you how to implement vSEC on top of Azure platform, and we will securely publish a web server to the internet. First, let's look on our agenda. We will start with a general overview of our environment and the topology that we are about to implement. We will continue and create the environment and deploy vSEC on top of it. We will add a web server onto the environment into a secure location. We will set up the firewall rules to securely publish the web server to the internet. And we'll demonstrate adaptive policy feature within Check Point. So this is how our environment is going to look like on Azure. We are going to implement a VNet, which is our own virtual network within Azure. And this VNet is going to have three subnets: the front-end subnet, the back-end subnet, and the web subnet. Front-end and back-end are connected to the firewall, and the web subnet will host the web server on it. Users coming from the internet will first traverse the firewall and its respective policy and blades, and only then will be either allowed or denied to access the web server. Hopefully by now you're hungry for some hands-on action. So without further ado, open up your browser and browse to Azure portal. The address is portal.azure.com. If you have not created an account with Azure yet, this is the right time to do it. So log in with your account. And once inside, click on New to create the new environment and firewall. Look for Check Point and choose Single Gateway. Click Create. Choose a name for our new firewall and a password which will be used later to access the firewall and configure it. Choose a name of the resource group, let's call it My Resource Group, and the location where everything is going to be created. Once done, click OK. Next, let's choose R80 as our version that we're going to implement. R80.10, and the type of license you're going to use. We're going to use bring your own license because we have 15 days trial included within that license, but you can also choose pay as you go, which means you will be billed by the hour and pay directly to Azure. Next, choose the size of the machine that you want the firewall to be implemented on. I'm going to leave it as is because D3 V2 is more than enough for our needs. And then installation type. You can do gateway only or gateway and management together, which is also known as standalone, or configure manually, which means you will choose how to do it through the first time wizard. So as mentioned, we're going to do the standalone configuration, and the rest of the options can stay as is. You can define your GUI clients, a bootstrap script which will be run during the installation, whether or not you're allowing to upload and download contracts and information to and from Check Point, and if you need additional disk for the installation. When you're done, click OK. Next, let's create our VNet. I remind you, VNet is our environment, so make sure Create New is selected. Choose the name for your VNet. Let's call it My VNet. And the address range which will be used in our environment. Click OK when done. Let's choose the subnets which will be created inside our VNet. So as you can see, there's the front-end subnet, which is this address range. We have back-end subnet, which is this address range. And when you're done, click OK. Click OK again to approve network settings. And as you can see, the configuration is being validated. You can go through it and make sure that everything is according to what you need. And once validation is passed, we can click OK and continue. Before we continue, just so you know, you can click here to download the template of the firewall configuration and metadata we just created. And this can be used later to replicate firewall configuration or to restore the infrastructure configuration of that firewall. Next, click OK. And purchase. Our firewall is now being created. Next, we would like to create the Web Subnet, shown here, and deploy the web server into it. I remind you we have the VNet that we've created, the two subnets front end and back end, and the firewall that is being currently set up and integrated. So let's go ahead and create our subnet and then deploy the web server onto it. To do that, from the portal, click on Virtual Networks on the left. If you cannot find it on the left, just click on More Services and look for Virtual Network. Once inside, choose the VNet we just created and choose subnets within it. As you can see, there's the front-end subnet and the back-end subnet. Click plus, choose a name for the new subnet and the address range that will be used in it, which is perfectly fine. Do not choose network security groups. We have our firewall to cover that. As for the route table, we will go ahead and create it soon, but for the time being, leave it as none. Click OK when done, and as you can see, it was created. Now, what we need to do is deploy a web server with a sample website on it. So just click on plus, look for Nginx, choose Nginx plus, click create, choose a name for the new server, so let's call it web server, disk type, change it to HDD, username other than admin, and then password. And the resource group that we're going to implement it in. We can actually use the same resource group we had with the firewall, and the location, and just click OK. Now let's choose a size for our web server. Actually, A1 standard is more than enough for our sample website. So just click select. Make sure our VNet is chosen, and for subnet, let's choose the subnet we just created for the web server. Make sure no IP address is allocated, public IP address. We do not want this web server to be exposed to the internet. We will do it through the firewall. And make sure that there is no NSG, network security groups, allocated for this web server. We don't need this. Obviously we have the firewall to protect, so we don't need the duplicate of protections. The rest of the parameters can stay as is. Just click OK, wait for validation to finish, and click purchase. So our web server will now be deployed. Next, let's create a route table, which will make sure that all traffic coming from the web subnet is always traversing through the firewall. To do that, choose route tables on the left pane. Once again, if you cannot find it, you can also click on more services and look for it. So clicking on route tables, you can see our existing route tables. Let's click add. Let's call it web, because this is going to be attached to the web subnet. Let's add it to our existing resource group. And make sure location is aligned with the location we've created our resources in. Click create when done. Now that the web route table was created, let's click on it and alter it. Add some routes to it. So click on it, click on routes, and then click add. Let's add route tables. The first one, let's call it to internet. And the address prefix. And then let's make sure that it directs all the traffic to a virtual appliance. So this is the interface of the firewall, our firewall on the internal interface. And then click OK. Next, let's attach it to our web subnet. So let's make sure that our VNet is selected and that our web subnet is attached. And then click OK. And now we've got a routing table that is attached to our web subnet. And everything on that web subnet will follow those routing rules, which means every traffic going to and from the internet will actually traverse through our vSEC gateway. Now that the environment is ready and firewall and web server were deployed, let's go ahead and set up the firewall rules. To do so, we need to log into the firewall with HTTPS, actually accessing the Gaia portal. To do so, let's find out first what is the IP address of the firewall. Click on Resource Groups on the left pane. Choose our resource group, the one that we've created. Choose the firewall public IP address as shown here. And voila, you can see the IP address of the firewall. Let's click copy, open a new tab, and type HTTPS and the address that we just discovered. Accessing this UI in the first time, you'll get this warning regarding the certificate authority. So click on Advanced, click on Proceed, and then log in using the username and password that we've created during installation. If this system is still being configured, you will get a note about this, but by now the system should be ready and up. Please note the installation and setup includes also the first time wizard and other steps and a few reboots. So be patient. If you get a message of the system is still being configured, please wait a few more minutes and then try again. Once inside, the first thing we would want to do is download the Smart Console. So click here on Download Now, and this will download the graphical user interface, which we will use later to control the firewall rules. Next, let's create a route on the firewall, which will route traffic destined to the Web Subnet through the internal interface. This is required because the firewall is not connected directly on the Web Subnet. So click on Add, click the address space of the Web Subnet, and then let's add a gateway IP address, and we're sending it through the internal interface of the firewall. Please note I've used the first address of that subnet, which resembles Azure. So click OK, and then click Save. If you've downloaded the GUI client, let's now open it. So Start, choose Smart Console R80.10. We're going to use our firewall IP address and the password we've created. If it's your first time, you'll get the fingerprint of the management server, so just click Proceed. As you can see, our own firewall is already configured, of course. Let's go ahead and move to the security policies. We need to create a policy which will allow traffic to go into the firewall with HTTP, and then we will NAT the traffic inside to the web server. So as you can see, there is already a rule, a default rule, a cleanup rule. Let's make sure that it's being logged. And let's add a rule on top of that rule. In this rule, let's create source any, because we want it to be publicly available on the internet. Let's add our firewall as the destination. So here it is. And let's choose the services that we would like to expose. So let's choose HTTP. We're also going to use HTTPS just in case, so we will have access to the firewall to manage its web UI. Let's make sure that it's accepted and that it's tracked. Next, let's create the NAT rule, which will forward the traffic, that same traffic, to the web server. So let's add another rule above, a NAT rule, pay attention. Source is internet, destination is firewall. Original services that we want to forward is HTTP. And the translated source, we want to keep it as is. The translated destination, we want to change and make sure that the web server. We need to create a web server object, so let's do that. We're going to create a new host object. Let's call it web server. And the IP address of that web server. If you're not sure what the IP address of the web server in your environment, you can also check on Azure, like we did for the management server. Next, click OK. And now that we've done, we can push policy. So pushing the policy will actually take effect. We'll create everything that we just set up and we'll push it and make it effective. So install policy, publish and install, and then install. Let's wait until the policy is successfully installed. And once it's done, let's check connectivity to our web server. So to do that, we actually need to go to our firewall IP address, the same one we used before, but instead of HTTPS, we want to go to the HTTP. This is the same protocol that will then be forwarded to our web server. As you can see, our Nginx web server is now accessed through the internet. We can also verify the connection on our logs. So click here to see the logs of the firewall. And then we can filter out only HTTP traffic. And then you can see all the connections that were made from my machine to the web server. So by now we finished setting up the environment. We were able to set up the firewall rules and NAT rules, and we are able to access our web server in a secure way, which means traffic first hits the firewall, then being inspected by the policy and any other security blade that we decide to activate. And only if it's allowed, then it will be NATed by the firewall inside to the web server. The web server does not have direct connectivity to the internet. It's actually being traversed through the firewall. On the next step, I'll show you the adaptive policy feature, which is actually the ability to create a policy with objects taken from our Azure platform and set them inside our policy. The benefit of doing this is, first, we do not need to create an object for every VM that exists on Azure. The second is that those objects that we pull from Azure environment are actually fully dynamic, which means if they change on Azure side, let's say Finance App 1 from Azure, someone on Azure side is changing its IP address. Our management server will know about this change within seconds and will automatically update the policy within up to 30 seconds. And then this object will be automatically updated in our policy. The same way that we can use VMs, we can also use tags or any other objects on Azure, for example, subnets, security groups. So this allows us great flexibility in connecting with the Azure environment. As you can see in this slide, there's also other environments which we can pull objects from. And as you can also see in this slide, we can mix and match between different platforms. So you can have one policy which has objects taken from all supported platforms: Azure, AWS, OpenStack, ACI, NSX, vCenter. You can mix and match and create a policy which will cover all of your environments in one place. And we're constantly adding and integrating new platforms, so you could expect to see Google Cloud Platform, new Azure networks, Alibaba Cloud integrations, and more. So stay tuned on that. Our next step is to connect between our security management server and between the Azure environment. This will allow us to be exposed to Azure native objects, such as the virtual network, the VMs, and etc. This is done using an API calls from the management server to Azure environment. To be able to do so, first we need to create an authentication method which our security management server will use to access Azure environment. To do so, first access Azure portal. From the Azure portal, click on Azure Active Directory. First, let's take a note of the directory ID. So click on Properties and copy directory ID. Let's place it in a Notepad file. Next, let's create our application registration. So click on App Registrations, click on New Application Registration, Let's choose a name for our new application registration and a sign-in URL. When done, click Create. Click on the new application registration we just created. Let's copy application ID, place it on our notepad file. Next, let's create a key, a secret key, which will be used by that app registration to authenticate with the Azure platform. So let's choose a name for that key and the duration. And once we click Save, we can see the secret value, the secret key value. Please pay attention, this value will only show up once and will not be able to be retrieved later on. Of course, we can always create new keys and use them. But let's add it on our notepad file. Secret key. We'll now add our new application registration to the designated resource group that we want to have permission to. So let's go to resource groups on the left pane, choose our resource group where we created all our resources in, choose access control, and click on add. We're going to need a reader role, and we're going to look for the new application we just created. Choose it, click on save, and that's it. Next, from our policy, let's create a new object which will represent the integration with the Azure environment. So click on New and then More, Server, Data Center, Azure. Type in a name for this new integration object. And now, with the information that we saved previously on our notepad, let's copy and paste it. So, application ID, application key, and directory ID. Click on Test Connection to verify that API works correctly and we are able to identify ourselves. And if it says connected, then we're good. Click OK. And then we need to publish those changes for changes to take effect. And now that controller is configured, we can add rules with objects extracted from Azure portal. So adding a new rule, and choose to add a new destination object. Instead of using the objects directly configured on the firewall, let's click on import and choose the data center object we just configured. And as you can see, those are objects extracted dynamically from Azure. So the management server accessed Azure portal when we clicked on import and extracted the objects from Azure. And now we can use them. We can choose to add a machine. Let's look for our web server, for example. So here's a web server. We can add it on the policy. And once this web server is added on the policy, we can also see his metadata, so the IP address assigned, and when was the last time it was updated. And so changes done on the web server on Azure will automatically be reflected in our policy, because the management server, once the object is added on the policy, then it tracks the status and health of those objects. And as long as the object exists on the platform, on the Azure platform in our example, we are tracking its metadata, IP, name, and any change done on Azure will also be reflected here. But the best part, it's not only reflected on the policy, it's also automatically pushed to the gateways and immediately takes effect. So if I am to change the object web server on Azure side, I'll show you how it's reflected on the policy. So going back to the Azure portal, I'm choosing the web server, choosing the network interface. And then I'm going to change IP configuration. Let's change it to .100 and save. Let's go back to our policy. As you can see, it's still not updated. It's 10.0.2.6. And you see the last time it was up to date. Remember, the management server keeps polling the information from Azure, and once on the next poll it will be notified that the server has changed its IP, and we will see it also reflected here. Here it is. So it was just updated to the right IP, and as you remember, it could take up to 30 seconds. This was shorter this time, and voila. For additional information, we would like to invite you on our website on www.checkpoint.com. Choose product solution and then choose cloud for vSEC related. There you can choose whichever platform that we support and then have access to documentation and literature. You can also contact our sales. Another great channel to use is our YouTube channel. So just look for Check Point Software Technologies channel. Here you can find a lot of testimonials and technical videos about our solution. Thank you so much for being with me today, and stay tuned for additional videos.